So this guy walks into a bar, and his name is Sean, and it's an Irish pub, and it's there on the docks. And it's a pretty rough and tumble place, about 100 years ago. And Sean goes in, and he sees Ed, the bartender. He orders his pint of beer. Ed pours it for him, brings it to him. And then Sean starts to speak with Ed, as it often happens between bartenders and those who sit at the bar. And Sean started bad-mouthing one of his neighbors, this guy named Tommy. And he was saying these kind of mean things about Tommy, making commentaries about him. And Ed, as he usually did, would just kind of nod his head, not really say much. And he said, "You know, Sean, when Tommy comes here, he always speaks well of you. Tommy always speaks well of you." So clearly they changed the conversation. And most stories that begin with a guy went into a bar are usually not true stories. Ed is actually my friend's grandfather. And about 100 years ago, he owned a bar, and it was an Irish pub, and it was on the docks. It was a pretty rough crowd. And whenever anyone spoke badly of another person, Ed would always respond, "Well, they always speak well of you." I think Ed, God rest your soul, my friend, Ed really captured what Jesus is trying to say in today's gospel. The summary of today's gospel is in just those three words: love one another. And it's not just the summary of today's gospel, but aren't those three words really the summary of Jesus' main message to us? Love one another. And I think sometimes we think of love in an abstract way. Right? It seems like this nebulous concept. I want to drill down today in what true Christian love is in just one aspect. But it's an aspect that affects all of our lives, all of the days of our lives. It is our words. How we show our love is through our words. And you may remember a few weeks ago we had a gospel passage. It's from Luke chapter 6. And verse 45 is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. Now, the preacher that weekend didn't focus on that, but I think it's one of those really underutilized, not misunderstood quotes from Jesus, but it's one of my favorites in the Bible. Jesus says this, and you can also find it in Matthew 12:34, the same exact phrase. From the fullness of the heart, the mouth speaks. Or one of the translations I like, words flow out of what fills our hearts. So if you hear someone who's constantly negative, critical, mean-spirited, what does that tell you about their heart? And if you hear from someone words of praise, adulation, support, comfort, forgiveness, what does that tell us about their heart? And the interesting thing about what Jesus said in today's gospel, love one another, the intro to it is not, "This is my suggestion," or "This is my wish list." Jesus said, "This is my commandment." If you really want to be a Christian, you really have to love one another. It's a commandment, not a suggestion. So obviously I'm speaking about speaking well of others. In Spanish, they have a great word for it, benedicencia, speaking well of others. Before I entered the seminary, I worked on the stock exchange in New York, and then worked on the exchange and the Pacific Exchange in California. And it was in the mid-'80s. There was something really interesting. Every office that I went to of our firms, and every place I went, there was a little sign. It was usually about this big, and it had just one word on it. And that word was think. And I later discovered that it was actually the founder of IBM, Mr. Watson. He wanted that to be in all of their offices, and it spread throughout so many other offices. Just that one word, think. And I remember as a young man working there, think before you act, think before you speak, think before you execute this deal, or whatever things we were doing. But then I learned another little poster, and this is a recent one. And this I have to thank Mrs. Kurza, our 8th grade teacher here at St. Elizabeth's. If you go in her classroom, she has a wonderful poster. It says, before you speak, think. But it takes each of those 5 letters of the word think, and it creates an acronym. So before you speak, the first letter T, ask yourself, is it true? Is it true what you're about to say to another person? Are you 100% sure that that is the truth? 100%. Second, the letter H. Is it helpful? Is it helpful for the person who's about to hear what you're going to say? Is it helpful for the person about whom you're speaking? The letter I. Inspiring. Is what I'm about to say going to be inspiring for those around me? Am I going to lift up their spirits? Am I going to encourage them to be the best version of Christians that they can be? Or will it fall short of being inspiring? The letter N, which I think is a really great one, and this should catch a lot of us. Is it necessary? Is what I'm about to say truly necessary to say? And then finally, the last one, the letter K, which I'm sure we could all think of. Is it kind? Is what I'm about to say kind? And I think importantly here, when we think about it, it's not just words that we speak. Because truly, words flow out of the abundance of our hearts. But it's also the words that we write with our thumbs in a text message, words that we type with our fingers in an email. You could summarize my entire homily up until this point with what we all learned from our mothers when we were little. And it's so simple, so basic, and why do we forget it? If you don't have anything nice to say it at all. So Sean finishes his beer. Sean thanks Ed. And Sean walks out of the pub and he's heading home. Who do you think Sean sees walking in his direction on the same sidewalk? Tommy. What does Sean say to Tommy? What does a real Christian say to Tommy?